Alright, so this is the final 3D render that we ended up with. Moving forward, we're going to take this piece through a few different iterations before we end up with the final paintover. I'll explain some art theory and concepts and touch on techniques that I use in my paintovers. If you're a complete beginner, this might not be the best video to learn from, as this is more targeted towards intermediate artists who know Photoshop fairly well and understand a lot of the art fundamentals. Enough blabbering, let's get started. Alright, welcome to the paintover part. Finally we got to the paintover stage. This is the first time I've ever actually recorded myself painting over a 3D base. So please excuse if I'm awkward or if I'm not explaining things well enough. Also, I'm having an issue with this version of Photoshop where sometimes my cursor just disappears, so I hope that's not going to be too distracting or too confusing. If you want to know what kind of software I'm using here, this is called PureRef. It's completely free and you can just drop in references like I have from the very start when I was trying to figure out her costume and her skin tone and also kind of what type of illustration this is. This is kind of the color palette I was inspired by. And these are the initial poses, the initial kind of ideas for this illustration, and also this was kind of the initial idea for the hatch, the ancient hatch. So I tend to always kind of keep these up to kind of remind myself, like if I've forgotten along the way what my initial goal was, just kind of keeping it there as like mental notes. Like right now I'm going to focus on, because I've pretty much gotten everything I want in the draft right now. So now I kind of need to focus on the more realistic side of things. So kind of bringing in a more realistic face, painting in more realistic hair, kind of getting rid of that 3D look especially is going to be very important. And right now, as I've discussed with my client, I kind of feel that she's, if I get my... Right now, I feel like she is very close to this hatch, and that's not necessarily what I want. I want this to seem like it's much closer to the camera view, and for this entire area to kind of be pushed a bit back. So what I might have to do is kind of either use the atmosphere, so kind of bring some of this atmosphere forward, or what I can do is sort of darken the hatch and make it more contrasted in terms of value. What I'm trying to basically say is that the further something is away from you, the more compressed the values will become on a black and white spectrum. And what I mean by that is something that is far away from you will utilize a narrow range on the value spectrum and be less contrasted, whereas something that is close to the camera will utilize a wider range of the value spectrum and will have more of a contrast. So the range of something close up to you could use like the whole value spectrum, whereas something farther away will be covered in atmosphere. So that atmosphere will kind of diffuse the values in a sense. And we use that not only because it's realistic, that's what happens in real life, but it really kind of helps guide the eyes as well in the illustration. I want the focal point to be on the hatch and the Viking, and in this illustration, for example, I follow that very same logic. Just look at how compressed the values are in the background. I used just a few different values to differentiate and pop out some of the details on the castle, whereas on the figure and horse, the values are a lot more contrasted and kind of jump all over the spectrum. If you struggle to kind of understand this concept, I highly recommend choosing illustrations of your favorite artists, turning them black and white, and just understanding how they use their values to kind of bring attention to certain areas and how to push back less important areas. So before starting any paintover, I tend to always adjust the color palette and experiment to see if I can find any color combinations that are better than the one I ended up with in the render. There are many ways of changing the colors, but I really like working non-destructively and find the selective color adjustment to be super useful. So I tend to adjust the whites, neutrals, and blacks to kind of see if I can find a better fit. Since there aren't that many whites, we're mostly going to be adjusting just the neutral and blacks. So obviously now we have the very desaturated character against these like bright red rocks, we're gonna bring some of that redness here in the eye makeup. If I go to my reference, let's see here, I kind of want to bring some of that redness into her face as well and kind of focus on the makeup especially and tattoos, because what I had originally, what I originally had in mind was to kind of add these type of tattoos. So I'm going to try doing that and maybe adding some of the details, because obviously I left things pretty rough. Like this is just literally a strip and you can even see the polygons. So we want to paint over that and give more of an idea of this being made out of leather, and this is metal, this is metal, this is cloth, and so on. Oh yeah, also I have the full render here because usually when I start to bring in photos, I kind of forget about the lighting situation, and it's very easy to kind of be swayed by the lighting situation in these photos, because a lot of them are shot in studios where the light is kind of very neutral. It's kind of coming from everywhere, so I always tend to just keep this up, so when I bring in a photo I can remember kind of the light shapes that I already established here, like this, and remember to kind of bring that into the photo as well. So we'll get into that later on. As for now, I'm actually just gonna try a few color combinations and see if I find something better. Alright, I think I'm happy with this. As you can see, I kind of lost some of that contrast, but we're obviously going to be bringing that back. But what I wanted to do essentially was to kind of, in the shadows, bring a bit of warmth. Because in general, in the image, I want there to be more warmth in the shadows, and especially like on her eyes and her cheek. Just basically areas where you find a lot of blood, kind of, you know, when you go outside and it's like freezing cold and you get like really pink cheeks, really red cheeks sometimes, like when it's bitter cold. I kind of wanted to give the idea of that, because subtle things like that I find kind of make an image. So it's just like nice little details like that is important to kind of think about, you know? So yeah, now that I have this color adjustment, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to duplicate it a few times. And then I am just gonna go down, and like I did when we were kind of trying to separate all the different layers, so I'm just gonna use clipping masks and clip them to their respective layers, and then I'm just gonna merge them. So that way when I'm actually painting, say I wanted to kind of start painting on actually this layer, that I actually have the correct colors, because if you have the color adjustment on top, say we chose this, if I now started painting and color selecting, if I now disable this, the colors are going to be wrong. So that's just something to be aware of, you know? Okay, now that we have that out of the way, I know it's actually not a good thing to probably focus on first, but I tend to always kind of fix the face in the image, because I feel like if you have a convincing and attractive face, it just helps sell the image a lot more. So usually when I'm sending clients update, I always tend to start with the face, because once we get rid of this 3D face, it just elevates the image to like a whole other level, if that makes sense. So I actually found a few references. This one was actually really close, and I was so surprised because that was like the first image I found on Google. Usually when I try to search for images on Google, I try to find something as close as I can. I usually ignore just the lighting and focus on, like you see here, her mouth muscles, her expression, how the brows kind of furrow and wrinkle, and the eyes especially. I also found a few other references, like I really liked kind of how her eyes looked here. And also here, I was thinking mostly about the mouth and how she would be clenching down, because as you can see here, this is just a very unconvincing 3D mouth. So, okay, so let's actually bring in this image, and I'll show you how I kind of tend to work in photos into my 3D bases. So right now the snow is incredibly distracting, so I'm actually just gonna disable that until we kind of start working on the paintover a bit more. And once I kind of feel finished with the paintover, I'm gonna add that like as the last thing. So what I usually tend to do is size it down to her face, or the guy's face if I'm drawing a guy, and kind of lowering the opacity here on the right, and then just trying to match it as best as I can. And sometimes obviously the proportion of the model I'm using isn't matching the 3D model, and that's totally fine. Sometimes I just replace the face that's already there, but in this instance I'm gonna try to kind of, oh yeah, my cursor is totally gone by the way, so I'm gonna reference on the screen what I'm pointing to, but this basically allows you to kind of manipulate the shape of the image. I try to usually match the model as best as I can, and let's actually zoom in here and try, let's see, maybe a bit down, maybe her eyes should actually go up a bit here. And it's totally fine like if it's not matching 100%, but just so we get a general gist. And you might be asking me, well, isn't this kind of cheating, using a photo and overlaying it on top? Well, yes and no, because obviously you're using someone else's photography in your own illustration, but since we'll kind of be painting over it and making it our own, it's not cheating. But also, if you're completely new to painting and you don't have your fundamentals down, kind of adding photos into your painting process might slow you down learning wise. I mean, it's all subjective, isn't it? Because for me, I try to get these done as quickly as I can for my clients, and I tend to have a lot of projects on at once, so the quicker I can get something done, the better. So in this instance, I don't think about cheating as much because I'm not as focused on learning from it. Right now, my focus is just to get to realistic rendering as quickly as possible. So if you're trying to kind of learn the anatomy of the face and the facial structures and how the muscles bend and everything, I would say don't use photos. Use photos to draw from, but don't use them directly in the canvas, if that makes sense. I hope I'm making sense. I'm so sorry. Like, this is completely new to be actually explaining my painting process. But yeah, okay, now that we have the face integrated, and if I switch it on and off, I think that looks pretty alright. The eyebrows are a bit misaligned because usually these eyebrows on the 3D models tend to be very exaggerated. So I'm actually going to stick to her eyebrows more to not make her look as cartoony. So there are different ways I go about incorporating a face into a painting. One method is, let's actually cut out her hair because we don't really need that. So now if you control click the image and then go to the Viking layer, or the Viking lady layer, and then right click and press layer via copy, we get a copy of the face here. So if I just call this color ref and then just kind of hide that, and now if I press on this layer again and go to image, adjustments, and match color, what we can actually do now is make sure we have our correct file selected, and then go to the layer and select color ref. It's going to convert the colors of the image to something closer to our reference image. So in this case, sometimes you might need to adjust it. So maybe bring up the brightness. Actually, I'm losing a lot of information in the bright area. So what I'm actually going to do is maybe increase the color. Actually, let's decrease the color a bit because I want her a bit desaturated. And if I go back and forth, you can see the difference. And if I now start kind of erasing some of the hair, you can see that she now feels like she's a bit more incorporated into the image. We might need to do a few more adjustments. So what I'm actually going to do is create a new layer, select the skin color here, try to get a bit bluish, and then clip mask that onto the layer and press color. And now I'm just gonna reduce the opacity a bit, so maybe to 35%. But I want to kind of keep some of that pink in her cheeks. I'm actually gonna just erase some of those, and on the nose, and maybe where she's scrunching her eyebrows, and just directly under her eyes. Maybe bring some of that pink in the lips as well. Yeah, and Control E, merge that. So that's one way of kind of incorporating the face. Another way I tend to kind of go about doing these things is maybe if I wanted to keep the original look of the 3D model instead, but just slightly have this kind of influence it, I tend to set the blending layer mode to overlay and then kind of adjust the levels. So you can kind of bring that brightness up. You can maybe, this one in the middle feels like it's better. And actually looking at this now, I feel like this is actually a bit better, so we might actually go for this version instead, and maybe bring in some of this, like especially the mouth. I think would be good to bring in, because this 3D mouth is just awful. So with the smudge tool, I'm actually going to try to pull out some of these values and just try to cover most of the face. And we're actually getting a lot of nice information, because by using overlay, you're kind of not replacing any of the values there. You're just overlaying, like literally overlaying on top of everything. And this is working out really nicely, because we're still keeping our darks and we're still keeping our lights, which is exactly what we want. So, and as you can see with her eyebrows, either we could completely smudge and get rid of this, but I actually think, I feel like her 3D eyebrows are a bit too cartoony, so I'm actually gonna just make a copy of the Viking woman, and I'm gonna try smudging some of the eyebrows here. Kind of move some of that white down. Let's smudge the other one. Just bring that down, because of the image obviously was cut off by her hair here. So what we have to do is kind of bring down the eyebrow here and just try to kind of fill out those blanks. And I'm gonna try to smudge the rest of the eyebrow, and yeah, I feel like that looks a bit better. So now let's focus on the mouth a bit. So you can see the difference there, isn't that crazy? And I really like what's happening with the eyes here as well, because you get some really nice dark makeup, which I really like. So yeah, that's great. So often I kind of switch between like this layer and the original Viking layer, and kind of smudge out areas to kind of get them to fit each other a bit better. You might actually have to try to smudge some of the mouth here. Let's see what happens if we do that. Yeah, that actually looks a lot better. So let's try to smudge the mouth. And let's try to smudge, obviously, the areas over the knife. What is going on here? Yeah, her face is really wide towards the bottom here, so I'm actually just going to erase some of that away. Okay, so I am actually going to go back to this old layer, and I'm going to select the mouth and layer via copy, kind of bring that in, hide that layer. I'm actually going to try to create a new layer and color pick, fill that whole layer, use the clipping mask and select color, and then I'm going to erase everything except for the mouth and merge that. And now I can start kind of erasing some of these edges around. Then try to erase where the knife is. Let's see, around here. Kind of got a nice little happy accident there, because it kind of looks like the teeth is getting reflected in the knife. So let's make sure not to erase too much and get rid of that happy accident. So I think I'm just gonna merge these together. So if I now clip that to our original Viking layer here, just look at that difference. Isn't that crazy? Oh, let's actually do the same with this one and toggle that on and off. That is already so much better, isn't it? It looks really weird now, just trust me, it's gonna get a lot better. So, all right. So let's Control E, merge that. Control E, merge the mouth as well. I usually like to kind of toggle on and off the layer to kind of see the changes that I've made. Right now I'm seeing the eyes are quite dark, and obviously if we want it to seem like she's a bit further back than the hatch here, the darkest darks in this area cannot be darker than the darkest darks here, if that makes sense. So we'll have to kind of push that back in value. And the way I tend to do that is by creating a new layer on top using a clipping mask. And I'm just gonna bucket fill with a brighter color, so maybe this bluish here. And then select lighten. So what that does is it basically kind of eliminates some of those values, and actually you can see the difference here. Hopefully the compression isn't too bad if I zoom in. You can see that it's kind of getting rid of those black values and replacing them with a brighter value. Yeah, it's kind of happening for the rest of the clothes as well, which isn't necessarily what we want. So I'm actually just going to select that area, hit delete. Yeah, I feel like that's much better. So merge that. So my original idea for hair, if we go back to, here, this is a good example. So I wanted her to kind of have this like shaven side here and here, and for some of these rings to kind of be connected to her hair, and there being chains here. So what I'm actually going to do is try to find an image that matches this angle, a woman that has kind of shaved sides, and I'm going to try to incorporate that into the image. Alright, so I found this reference, which I think would be suitable. The head isn't exactly in the same position, but I think it'll work. So if we just kind of select that, let's select the ear as well, maybe the surrounding areas. It's a bit blurry, so that's fine. We'll just kind of fill in the blanks. So copy that, paste that, and let's bring that down. So just like before, we're gonna go to Image, Adjustments, and Match Color. And then we're going to choose the file, obviously, and then choose our color ref. And yeah, that's pretty good. Let's actually increase the intensity of the colors. And then let's bring it down. Let's see how close. See, it actually matches the ear fairly close. Let's actually lower the opacity a bit and then try to move it so that it matches the ear as best as we can. Oh, maybe move it up here. Yeah, there we go. I love this transformation tool. Like, it's just so handy. I use it all the time. So maybe like this. Bring up the opacity and let's start kind of erasing some of these areas. And it's okay, like if some of these areas aren't completely visible just yet, we'll eventually bring him in. So just make sure that that looks like it fits in a bit better. Obviously her ear is super pink now, so we're just going to select that and kind of desaturate that a bit. We definitely want to keep some of that pinkness because I think it looks really nice. So let's see if we can actually copy that. So by holding Control Alt, you can copy it. And then we can kind of flip it. And if you want to know how to flip it, because I obviously have some shortcuts set up here, you just select this moving tool and then Control select your thing, right click and press flip horizontal. So let's see if we can try to kind of incorporate that in. Maybe bring it in. Let's see, it's all the way down there. Actually try to crunch the values a bit. Sometimes just darkening doesn't help, so if we crunch the values and then brighten it and then crunch it some more and then brighten it. Basically we're making it less contrasty, and most of the time that works really well. So let's try to... Alright, so another glaring issue, obviously this hair is now black, but we want our albino Viking to have white hair. So what I'm actually going to do is just select all of the dark parts of the hair and press Ctrl I to invert it, and then I'm going to bring down the saturation, maybe up the brightness just a bit. I think we can bring a bit more blues in there, so let's actually still keep that selection. Maybe select some of these brighter parts with a bit more blue in it, and then do the color adjustment again. Let's merge that down, and now let's try to kind of blur some of those edges. And I actually want her eyes to be fairly bright, so on the hair layer I'm gonna choose the color in the eyes and try to brighten them. Let's see how much we can push it. I know I said we weren't going into the overpaint stage just yet, but I just want to brighten them because I feel like that changes a lot. So let's... Another thing I wanted to work in was this kind of very dark makeup. In our original concept, I had this, and I think I'm going to use a combination of both. So I want the top part of the head to actually be covered, maybe like this or like this, and then I'm going to try to add in some symbols. So we just kind of add this in for reference. Create a new layer, Control select our Viking woman, and let's actually create a mask instead. So what that does is basically if I fill anything in this layer, it will only be covered in the white areas of the mask here. If I go back, so now I'm actually going to use the gradient tool, and I'm going to try to darken the top part of her head. And set the multiply layer to multiply. So I obviously wanted kind of a red color, so let's try switching that to red. I don't want to go too saturated, so let's just kind of clear the arms and clear the top part of her head here. I'm actually going to reduce the opacity on this a bit, because what we're actually losing a lot of now is the light on the face that I was talking about. These kind of lights, so let's actually try to bring some of that back. So instead of erasing that, I'm just gonna use a brighter color, a bit of a cool color, and with overlay and a soft brush, I'm gonna try to kind of bring some of that back. I'm gonna use the same mask as the previous layer, so you just Control select that and hit the mask tool. Everything outside of the Viking area kind of disappeared. Oh yeah, and be careful, try not to stay too zoomed in. I'm kind of zooming in because obviously you can't really see my cursor that well, so I thought it would be easier for you guys to kind of see what I'm doing when I'm a bit more zoomed in. But usually I tend to work a bit further away, and I advise you to work further away as well, because when you start getting into like detailed territory, you can like really zoom in there and you can spend ages on like this area, whereas like you won't really be seeing that much of it because you're going to be seeing everything like pretty far away. Yeah, let's actually try adjusting some of that color, see if we can make it a bit cooler. Yeah, that's much better. Let's try going back to that red color. You can see that transition happening between the black paint and the skin. Let's try to actually get a bit closer to that. First, I'm going to try to bring a bit more redness in the eyes. So I'm going to try a bit of a textured brush. Like this brush is a bit more textured, and I feel like it's a bit closer to actually what we're seeing in the image here. So, and I know I'm going to get the question of like, oh, what brushes are you using and stuff like that, but honestly, it's not that important. Whatever brush kind of gives you a bit of texture, you can kind of Google online. A lot of artists have given their brushes away. For me, these are just some of those brushes that I've kind of accumulated over the years, so they're not like super important. Yeah, you can see I'm kind of dragging the brush down to kind of get that textured look. And this is still not getting into the full kind of Paintover stage. I'm still just kind of laying the base, kind of getting an idea of like where this is heading direction wise. And I think it's sort of getting there. So I want to pay attention to the hairline here and try to kind of replicate what is happening there. So I want some of this red to kind of spill into the hair. So if you're familiar with my paintings, you're going to see that I use a lot of kind of textured brushes, because when you zoom into my paintings, you see a lot of this kind of texture. But when you zoom out far away, you don't really see it as well. It's just a look I really like, and I think I'm kind of slightly inspired by Simon Stålenhag. If you haven't seen his paintings, they're just absolutely amazing. The way he can kind of create so much information with just like a few strokes, a few texture strokes, is just absolutely amazing. So yeah, you can see here I'm trying to bring some of those darks up, but also I'm not bringing them like up all the way here, because you see when I get up here it kind of breaks the value. So I tried to kind of do it a bit more subtly and then bring some of that white down, if that makes sense. Let's try to focus on the hair right now. So I know I might seem a bit scatterbrained. I tend to go a bit back and forth when it comes to the Paintover, because if I stay in one area too long, I might get a bit blind to my own kind of painting, and I might neglect other areas that really need my attention. So right now, like, I'm gonna focus on the hair, and then after the hair I'm gonna move on to the clothes and try to get them looking a bit better. So let's see if we can actually find a good reference for the hair. Okay, for the hair I found a few examples. So I found a few buns, because I want the hair to kind of be kind of like dreads, so really thick. I want some of it to kind of be spilling out like on the side here. They're all gonna be kind of tied together by these like ties. If I just kind of size that up so you can see a bit better. I think this image is really good. Like the bun on top looks really good, and the way it kind of starts out here on the bottom and kind of transitions into a bun, I think is quite a good example. And for some of these, I'm gonna copy paste these around to kind of fit into all of these different areas. So let's start with the top and kind of work us down towards the bottom. But before that, I'm actually gonna start merging. So usually when I start kind of getting into the more detailing stage of things, I like to kind of create groups. Just look at that difference. Wow. So yeah, I'm gonna create a group, and then I'm gonna duplicate it, and then I'm gonna merge that group with Control E. So now I have a copy of everything, just in case I want to kind of go back. Okay, let's start adding in some of that hair. Because obviously she's in the image, she's looking down, and our Viking woman is looking up, so we need to kind of ignore that, but just try to find something that works. A nice middle ground. Maybe there. And sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't, so we'll just try to see how it looks. If it doesn't work, we'll just try something else. And let's try to actually crunch these values a bit, so bring up the darkness areas a bit, and maybe Yeah, so actually let's try to bring it up a fair amount. And let's use our color trick again. So set it to color. I think we might have to actually go a bit darker with the hair. So let's do that. Maybe. I'm not completely sold. Let's try actually another image. So let's just disable that for now. Let's just try to bring in another image. I am liking this a bit more better, but I'm not kind of convinced about the area where the hair kind of transitions. So, so I'm actually going to add a mask, and then I'm going to use black and try to kind of push it a bit further. So if I push it up to here, does that look weird? Let's see. So I wanted to kind of give her like a mohawk look. So I want to stay true to that. So obviously we're losing a lot of that light information that was here. So let's actually go back to our render. And let's try to roughly with a clipping mask paint that brightness in. So with the white and set to, let's see, stoplight. Let's go for overlay. I'm gonna try. Imagine that the sun is coming down, so it's hitting all of these small surfaces that is facing the sun. So I need to think about the shapes like this. And in the shadow areas here, they aren't receiving sun, so that's going to be darker. So you need to think about the shapes like this. You can obviously see that very prominently here on the 3D render, which is why I think having this 3D render really helps, because you can see those shapes pretty clearly. So I'm actually going to use a bit of a texture brush like this. If I just make it a bit bigger, texture brush like this, because I feel like that usually gives a very nice kind of hair texture. As it's turning away, like here the form is turning away, here as well and here as well, they're not facing the sun, so these wouldn't be getting the sun. Let's create another clipping mask and a darker color, maybe multiply, and as you can see, the texture brush doesn't work as well in the dark areas. It just kind of gets a bit too textured, so I tend to kind of blur that. Actually, I'm going to use a softer brush here and a different color. I'm going to desaturate that a bit more. Try to just push that back ever so slightly. I don't want to go too dark because this is white hair, and obviously as you see here in the 3D render it doesn't get that dark. So what I'm actually going to do, once I've darkened things a bit more, I'm going to create another clipping mask, and I'm going to try to pick a brighter color, and with lighten I'm going to try to lighten all of the shadows. So now I think I manually want to kind of paint in this transition because it kind of looks horrible right now and it's sort of bothering me. So let's actually look at this reference and try to do something similar. So we know our hairline starts about here, and I think I want to kind of make a shape that's going back like the original concept, and maybe some secondary areas here on the side. That makes sense. Actually, maybe some of this hair is going to be covered by the hair coming down here. And maybe some hair coming down here. I think that would look nice, so let's try to actually paint that in. So I'm going to select our shadow, Actually, I'm gonna select this blue color and I'm just gonna try to bring down the hairline a bit. As you can see, this texture brush like looks really nice. And pay attention here where it's like darker. Where you're seeing now is basically this shape in the reference, and you see these areas that are not receiving light are darker, and as it transitions upwards here, the areas that are kind of closest to our light source, which is probably from the top, like here, is going to be a lot brighter, but as it transitions downwards and down towards the roots here, this is mostly going to be dark. So that's a look I'm trying to kind of replicate in my work. Then I want some of this to kind of come down here. We're going to pay more attention to these areas later on. Again, we're just trying to kind of get down the general gist of everything so that when I send this to my client, he gets a good idea of like, okay, this is what she's thinking of doing, like this is the direction she's headed in. So I don't want to go too detailed, because if he wants any changes, then I wouldn't have already spent that much time doing that. So it'd just be like, okay, if you don't want that, that's fine. So yeah, I'm just gonna mostly indicate what I'm thinking. It's just kind of, it's kind of like sketching. You're just noting down ideas for future reference and for your client's reference. Still not very convincing. I feel like her hairline is maybe a bit too high up. So I want it to get darker the further up you get to the skull. Kind of that smooth transition. So the closer you get to the neck, the more it's kind of shaved. That's kind of the look that I'm going for here. So it's kind of this nice balance of trying to get things textured and also trying to kind of smudge a lot. Like I use a smudge tool a lot to kind of get rid of details when it gets to texture. Because if I were to use this texture everywhere, it would just be a bit too much. You need to kind of be selective about that. But yeah, let's try. I think usually when you see people with shaved sides, you kind of have all these like tiny hairs kind of catching the light. So I'm gonna try to do that. That would also create some separation between the head and the arms, so that would be really nice. Too much. And isn't that so much better? Yeah. Slowly getting there, slowly. Yeah, all right. So we have a lot of these weird random strands kind of poking out. So either you can kind of delete them from this original layer, but I think I'm actually just gonna paint over them. So just try to integrate them into the hair that we already have going. So using the same values and just again paying attention to the direction of the sun and where it's hitting the hair strands. Alright, we're not too far from being finished with the hair here before we kind of move on to the lower parts. So let's just finish out this strand. And there we go. So let's actually merge that with the layer below. So you press Ctrl E and just press apply. And yeah, that looks so much better, doesn't it? Alright, okay. So before I move on to the rest of the hair, I'm going to do something very scary. I'm going to flip the image, which I'm always very scared of, and see how it looks. Let's see, flip the canvas. Doesn't look too bad, but I can see an error right away. That's why you always actually should be flipping the image, but I just always tend to forget. Right here, her head is connecting with the ear right away, so we need to kind of carve out some of that space. I don't think the ear is placed wrong, it's just that with the shadow transitions that I got going on here, if I kind of draw over like this, and then have the ear kind of poke out like this, and then you have like a light shape here, and then you have the ear, and then another light shape there. So if I go back now, you can see I've lost a lot of that, so I will be painting that in. It's crazy how just like these bright shapes actually do so much. You don't really think about it. So that's kind of the scary thing about painting over, because sometimes you kind of get rid of these shapes, these information that you get from the render itself, and you don't realize. So let's see. Yeah. I think we should kind of bring the same shadow color as the arm here, because this isn't really reading as a shadow. What if we make this entire arm darker? Yeah, I think that's the better route to go. So I think we should actually make this entire arm darker. So let's create a multiply, clip that there, and let's try to kind of select the arm. Kind of that shadow shape. Now to be super accurate right now. Just let's fill that in and then push it way back. So it's all about kind of having shapes overlap. So having kind of light shapes on top of dark shapes on top of light shapes again. That kind of consistent overlap really gives a lot of depth to the image. So now if we zoom out a bit, doesn't that read against her arm like so much better? Obviously we would have to kind of smudge some of these transition areas a bit so it's not that obvious. But I personally think that reads so much better. So let's flip it again and hope everything looks okay. Yeah, I think we need to go even darker on her hair actually. So let's just merge that and create a layer on top of the hair right here. Select a softer brush and try to just darken that general area. The reason I'm kind of darkening the sides here is if you kind of think about it as this is a plane, and here things are kind of turning around, if I can kind of turning around like this. And when you have little strands like this for hair, you'll see that a bit more prominent around where things curve, because things will overlap the most in these areas. So you'll get all these tiny hairs overlapping the most here. So you'll get, if I get rid of that, so you'll get most of those dark kind of strands here. And then we can, because we have the light hitting it, we can kind of create some light shapes, and that will really kind of drive home the idea of like dark against light against dark again. So that's kind of the idea I'm trying to drill home, if that makes sense. And then let's try to bring in some of that brightness. So I'm actually going to merge the hair because I'm pretty happy with the hair. So I'm just going to merge the multiply layer as well. And then I'm going to try to bring out those bright hairs, but not as bright as this because that would be way too much. So I'm going to color pick the bright color here. Ooh, I can select it. Okay, so that makes her arm or her head pop out from her arm a lot better. So now that we're done with that, let's start focusing on the rest of the hair here. So now that I've touched on a lot of the techniques I use while painting, I'll be speeding up the rest of the series, or else the paintover would just last like 10 hours long, which is a bit ridiculous. I'm sort of cursing at past Christina because she decided at this point that she would stop voice recording while working on this project, so it's now up to me to like pick up the slack. Anyway, I'll be following a similar process for the rest of the hair, basically dropping in a photo, changing the colors and values to match the hair that I already have established, and use the warp tool to just make the hair follow the flow of the 3D draft. I also erase any of the parts I don't want and even copy one of the strands to kind of give the silhouette of the hair a more interesting shape. Here I just duplicated the hair and flipped it vertically to build on the braided hair parts. I also tried to bridge that gap so it's less obvious that I've copy and pasted the hair. And finally, I start adding in some of those hair bands that keeps the dreads locked in place. Notice I wrapped it around the hair as if the hair is a real three-dimensional object that exists in 3D space. Having that 3D reference here really helps. And again, just copying the hair and adjusting it so it tapers off towards the bottom. So this portion of the hair definitely needs to be darkened and pushed back, and notice how I drew some of the bright strands on top to give the illusion of depth. I'm going to repeat it over and over, but bright overlapping darks and vice versa really helps give a better sense of depth in an image and just makes things like pop out so much more. Here, past Christina is reiterating which surfaces will be receiving light according to the logic of light in our scene. So only parts of the hair facing upwards will receive more light, and other surfaces sloping downwards and away will receive less light. With an overlay layer, I brighten up these portions. And just notice how this time around, how I actually waited with the light and shadow values until I had the entire shape of the hair done. It's a lot easier to make these things look more cohesive that way. So again, I start with the lights and work on the top surfaces, and then bring in the shadows after. It's crazy how much of a difference this makes. It just instantly makes the hair feel way more three-dimensional. This isn't the only surface that will receive light. The top of the ear, even though it is in shadow, will receive light from the sky. So it's important to add in those type of environmental lights, even in your shadows, in order to kind of make the shadows feel less flat. No need to go overboard though, even a bit of implied detail goes a long way. Time to fix up the knife area, which had been bugging me for ages. And finally, the head chains. Before trying to render the chains to look metal, like material-wise, I had to first lay down the overall shapes of the chains. Then I could finally start darkening the right side of the chains and popping out areas that were more likely to receive lighting. And of course, we can't forget the cast shadow from underneath the chains, which is very important. I decided to make the red paint even more intense by using a multiply layer, as the paint before was just a bit too subtle. And yeah, that's where we'll leave it for today. Anyway, I'm hoping you found this part useful, and hopefully it will give you guys a better idea of what my workflow looks like when it comes to painting over 3D renders. Anyway, next time I'll touch on how I painted in the clothing, how I added in some of the tattoos, how I added in the symbols, and so on. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye!